Colin Aldrich had not expected such a turnaround. Everything in his life seemed to be going just fine. 6 months ago, he had received a promotion at work, as well as a nice raise. Celia's interior design business was growing, and now she was making a significant contribution to their family budget. The house they bought 2 years ago is not a luxury home, but it's spacious enough for their needs and is in a good neighborhood. Recently, he and Celia had started talking about children, so he hadn't expected problems when they caught up with him. Colin couldn't help but notice the unfamiliar car parked in front of his house, but it didn't bother him. He was concerned, however, when he stepped out of the garage and found Celia sitting in the living room next to another man. When he entered the room, she immediately stood up, and Colin couldn't help but notice how slender and attractive she looked. It was only when he shifted his gaze to her face that he saw she was nervous. "Hi, honey," she greeted him, then gestured to the man still sitting on the couch. "You remember Vince Callahan?" she asked. "He's a client of mine, and I did the new interior design for his office. You've met him before." "Oh yeah, I remember now. Hey, Vince, good to see you again. What brings you here?" Vince gave Celia a confused look and she coughed. "Shit, this is so hard," she said quietly. Then she took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for the challenge ahead. "Honey, I don't really have any other choice. I'm leaving you." Those words made no sense to him. "What did you say?" She shook her head sadly. "I realize this will shock you, but I've filed for divorce." He half stumbled over to the chair opposite the sofa and sat down heavily. "What? Why?" "We didn't mean for this to happen," she said remorsefully, "but Vince and I fell in love. We've been dating for quite some time now, and we don't want to hide our love anymore." "You were having an affair on the side?" Colin asked dumbly. She cast a quick glance at her lover. "All right. We didn't plan it, but after a while we just couldn't deny our feelings for each other. Anyway, I've already loaded some of my stuff into the car. I'll come back for the rest later." But... but... Colin stammered. She ignored his unsuccessful protest and held out an envelope he hadn't noticed. "Here are the papers and everything else. I tried to be very fair about the settlement, but just so you know, I did go ahead and withdraw half of our savings. Anyway, you should get your attorney to look into everything. If you have any problems, he or she can contact my attorney, whose business card I attached to the notice." He dumbly accepted the envelope, still trying to comprehend what was happening. As he sat holding it, she turned back to Vince and took his hand. He stood up, and the two of them moved toward the door. "But why? What?" "I already explained," she interrupted. She nodded to Vince, and he opened the front door. She turned around one last time, she said, "So I think we should go. And Colin, I'm really sorry. I want you to know that this isn't about you. It's about me, okay?" And they left, taking with them the happiness he'd enjoyed for the last 8 years. Colin had always thought of himself as balanced. When faced with an emergency at work, he could always calmly and quickly analyze a problem before deciding how to proceed. Today, that ability had left him. Now his thoughts were chaotic, jumping from one topic to another, unable to focus on any of them. How could I not realize this was happening? Where do I find a good lawyer? How do I prepare for my meeting with Ferguson tomorrow morning? I wonder if Celia has anything planned for dinner. How do I even deal with this? The thoughts raced, swirling and repeating in his brain, each one demanding attention until he clapped his hands, trying to make them stop. In desperation, he stood up and headed for the bedroom. Throwing off his clothes, he left them lying where they had fallen, and then climbed into bed in mental exhaustion. Surprisingly, he soon fell asleep and stayed in bed until the next morning. When he awoke, the flood of thoughts had subsided, but he was surrounded by evidence of the new reality of his life. He noticed at once that Celia was not lying beside him, and when he went to dress, he found her part of the closet empty. When he went into the kitchen to make himself some coffee, his footsteps seemed to echo in the empty house. Even as he looked out the window, the North Carolina morning seemed even more bleak. Vince Callahan woke to Celia staring at the ceiling with her hands behind her head. "What's on your mind, baby?" he asked. "Colin, I guess," she said. I hope he's okay. He'll be fine, Vince said dismissively. I hope so, she said. When we left, he looked like he was in a state of shock. I felt bad. He wasn't a bad husband. It's just kind of stale, you know? It won't happen to us, he vowed. You'll have a lot of fun. He pinched her playfully, then rolled over onto his back and kissed her passionately. Oh, Vince, yes, she breathed out, and the memories of last night's passion came rushing back to her. All thoughts of Colin quickly evaporated from the sensory overload. The envelope handed to him by Celia sat on Colin's desk in the office for most of the day. When he couldn't put it off any longer, he opened it and began reading the divorce petition and the proposed financial settlement. But concentrating on the dry legal language was difficult because he didn't want a divorce to begin with. He felt like putting his head on his desk and crying, but he didn't want anyone in the office to see him in that state. After a few minutes, he stood up and slowly made his way down the hall to his boss's office. This woman had hired him back in the day, and he considered her his mentor. She looked up at him as he tapped on the door jamb, then looked closer. Are you all right, Colin? You don't look so good. With a pained expression on his face, he asked, Do you know the name of a good divorce lawyer? Oh, hell, Colin, not you and not Celia. Sit down. With those words, the woman stood up and closed the office door, then sat down on the chair next to Colin and put her hand on his forearm. Tell me what happened, she asked with obvious concern. This time Colin couldn't hide his tears. When Colin finally met with the lawyer his boss had recommended to him, he soon regretted having done so. His advice was straightforward. Take what Celia offered and run. But I don't care how favorable her offer is, Colin protested. I don't want a divorce at all, and I certainly don't want to pay her to leave me and live with some other guy. The lawyer sighed. Look, you need to approach this issue rationally. You can't force your wife to stay married to you if she wants to leave, and frankly, you wouldn't want her to stay if all you get is an unhappy wife. As for paying her, you don't see it on my part. All that Celia, her name is Celia, isn't it? All she's asking for is a division of your current assets. She's not even asking for alimony. Apparently, she plans to remarry as soon as the divorce goes through. Look, I've seen wives claim their husbands' retirement accounts, demand crippling alimony, and claim most of the marital assets, including the house. Your wife is being reasonable. You don't want to make her angry and vindictive. Maybe so, said Colin stubbornly, but the fact remains that I still do not want to divorce. The lawyer nodded and his tone became sympathetic. Look, Colin, you need a spousal counseling lawyer. First of all, I don't know anything about it. And second, I charge a lot more than any marriage counselor. If you're not ready to sign a contract, my advice is to find someone who can help you sort out your feelings. When Colin told his boss about the meeting, she surprised him by handing him a business card. I thought you'd react the way you did after we talked. I think you should see Dr. Helmar. He's a psychologist specializing in marital problems. I've had several friends who have used his services and they all rave about him. Give him a try and see if he can help. On his third consultation, Colin was repeating his string of complaints when Dr. Helmar interrupted him. Look, Colin, let's be honest. You're fixated. I want you to change direction mentally. I'm sure you're familiar with the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. People make the mistake of thinking they are no different, and you don't have to go through them in a neat, step-by-step fashion. Listening to you, I have at one time or another heard you describe all 5 stages except acceptance. This is perfectly natural for someone experiencing what you have experienced. But you have also said that you are a rational thinker, capable of figuring out problems and finding solutions. That's what you need to do now. Let go of your emotional distress in order to develop a strategy that will allow you to move forward. In your mind, you know Celia doesn't want to come back. In your mind, you realize that you don't want her back if she doesn't want to be with you, until you can accept the reality of this, over which you have no control, I will add. You will continue to be stuck. You need to address the problem of life after Celia with facts, just as you have done when faced with other problems in the past. Colin sat in silence, mulling over what the counselor had just said. He realized that much of the pain he was feeling was due to the fact that everything had happened so crazily and unexpectedly. There had been no warning, no indication that their marriage was in danger. Just one day he was a happy husband, and the next day he was close to divorce. Just one day he believed Celia loved him, and the next day he found out she was sleeping with another man. How do I move forward when I don't know which of these things are real? And how do I move forward when I'm feeling all this anger? The counselor listened to Colin's outburst in silence. Once Colin was silent, Dr. Helmar asked, "Have you ever heard of Reinhold Niebuhr?" Colin shook his head negatively. He was a well-known theologian of the 20th century who wrote a simple and powerful prayer. God, give me the serenity to accept what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's the Serenity Prayer. I've heard of it. It's what they pray in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's right. Anyway, in my opinion, it simply and eloquently reflects going through the stages of grief. This is what you need to strive for: calmness, acceptance, and wisdom. Without doing that, you can't move on. As Colin left the session that day, Niebuhr's prayer continued to echo in his head. Peace of mind is what I want in my life. The question is, how do I achieve it? What can I do to find peace? After an entire weekend spent in reflection, he decided on a plan of action. On Monday, Colin called his lawyer. "I'll agree to anything Celia asks if I can talk to her face-to-face for half an hour." "Are you sure?" the lawyer asked. "I've seen how horribly badly such meetings go, and very few of them satisfy either party in a divorce. This time will be different, I promise. Set it up." As Colin was led into Celia's lawyer's conference room, he was surprised to see Vince sitting next to her holding her hand. It's actually kind of nice, Colin thought. Now Vince and Celia could hear everything with their own ears. Celia's lawyer gestured for him to begin, and Colin cleared his throat. "Look, Celia, this is as hard for me as it is for you. Things didn't work out between us the way I wanted them to, but I guess that's the way it is with a lot of things in life. In this case, what's done is done, and now it's time for me to move on. My attorney told me that you offered a fair settlement and advised me to accept it. In the spirit of moving forward, I am willing to do so." He picked up a pen that was on the table and signed the agreement with a flourish. When the couple on the other side of the table exchanged glances of relief, he added, "I have one more thing to say." Both froze, fearful of what would follow next. "I understand that you are planning to get married as soon as the divorce is finalized," Colin continued. "So to keep you on track, let me wish you a happy marriage." With these words, he walked around the table and shook hands with the astonished Vince. Then he leaned over and gave Celia a friendly hug and kissed her on the cheek. The lovers looked at him in surprise, and he turned and left the room. They looked at each other. "What was that just now?" Vince asked. Celia shook her head in amazement. "Wow! Not at all what I expected." Then she smiled. "But it's wonderful. The last thing I wanted was a war between us every time we saw him." When the terms of the divorce were settled, Colin was to sell the house they owned together. Celia had no interest in it because she had already moved into the house that Vince owned. Colin didn't have the funds necessary to buy Celia's part. And even if he did, he realized that the house was too big for him. Besides, there are too many memories associated with it, he decided. The good news was that the real estate market was at its peak, so it wouldn't be hard to sell the house. The bad news was that since Colin and Celia had only bought the house 2 years ago, they hadn't had time to accumulate much equity, even in a strong market. In the end, Colin walked away from the auction with enough money to make a down payment on a 2-bedroom condominium in a good neighborhood. By the time the old house was sold, the new condo was purchased, and Colin moved in. The waiting period for the divorce to be finalized was almost over. Through a friend, Colin learned that Vince and Celia had already sent out wedding invitations. Colin did not receive an invitation, but he did learn that the happy couple were going on a honeymoon to the Caribbean for a week. He made his plans accordingly. When the tanned couple returned, Vince picked Celia up in his arms, about to carry her over the threshold. But as he crossed it, he noticed the index card slipped under the door. "Check the back porch," it said. Concerned, he set his new wife on her feet, took her hand, and hurried to the veranda. At first, he didn't see anything unusual, but when he turned in the right direction, his eyes widened, and he aghast. There stood a gorgeous 3-burner propane grill plugged in and ready to go. He turned to Celia again. "You bought this for me? I've always wanted one, but they're so expensive." "No," she admitted. "I don't know anything about it." Before he could finish, she noticed an envelope taped to the shiny stainless steel grill cover. Hastily walking over, she pulled it off and opened it. When she read the card inside, she gasped. "I can't believe it! It's from Colin!" It said, "Best wishes in your new marriage." It was a gift from Colin, Vince asked in disbelief. If that's what he meant by moving on, then all I can say is that he's a more generous man than I am. The gift is awesome. I'll be excited to grill on it this summer. I should call and thank him, Celia said as Vince checked the grill's capabilities. When Colin answered the phone, Celia could hear the surprise, gratitude, and even a hint of guilt in his voice. "Colin, we just found your wedding present. I can't believe you bought such an expensive grill for us. It's too much." Did Vince like it? Did Vince like it? He's still standing on the porch, drooling over it. "Good, that's what I was hoping. But you shouldn't have done anything like that. We didn't even send you an invitation to the wedding." Colin laughed. "Of course we didn't. That would have been too weird." But he was serious, saying it was time to accept what had happened and move on. "The gift is just my way of showing that I did. I hope you and Vince like it." When Celia returned to the veranda to tell Vince, he shook his head in surprise. "Like I said, he's more generous than I am. Anyway, how about we make some burgers for dinner tonight, Mrs. Callahan?" As April turned to May, Celia and Vince began making plans to celebrate Mother's Day with Celia's mom. They discussed taking her out for brunch at a nice restaurant, but when the idea was suggested, her mother was reluctant. "Mother's Day is always such a downer. I'd be just as happy if you both came here for brunch." So it was agreed that the newlyweds would bring a special meal consisting of salmon and vegetables cooked on the grill, Vince's new favorite toy. On the way out, Celia asked her husband, "Did you remember to buy flowers for Mom?" With a furrowed brow, Vince quickly turned off the highway and pulled into the parking lot of a regional grocery store chain. Soon he returned with a dozen pink roses. "They're a little out of shape," he apologized to Celia, "but the intention is the main thing." After arriving and taking the dishes and food into the kitchen, Vince handed the roses to Celia's mother, with wishes for a happy Mother's Day. "Thank you, Vince. That's so sweet," she told him. "I'll put them in a vase later." Then she suggested they set the table in the kitchen and take the plates to the dining room. "Your daddy is starving," she whispered to her daughter. As they brought the food in, Celia couldn't help but notice the gorgeous floral arrangement in the middle of the dining room table. "Mommy, they're gorgeous," she said. "Did Daddy give these to you?" Her mother snorted. "Did he? He said I wasn't his mother. Colin actually sent them. Aren't they beautiful?" "Colin?" "Well, yes. Isn't that nice of him?" said her mother. Nodding, Celia saw a frown flicker across her new husband's face. Later that afternoon, when they were home and Celia had a few minutes to spare, she called Colin. "Why did you send my mother that flower arrangement?" she asked. "Oh, good, so they were on time. Did she like them?" "Of course she liked them," Celia admitted. "They are beautiful. But why did you send them?" Colin sighed. "Your mother was always very kind to me, and since my mother died many years ago, I've always felt close to yours. So I wanted to honor her memory. I hope that won't be a problem." No, not at all. Like I said, she appreciated your concern. I just didn't expect this, that's all. To be honest, I really appreciate it too. Okay, and unless I've made a huge blunder, I have a favor to ask of you." Sure. What's that?" "It's a little awkward, but I think it's time for me to get back to the dating game." He could almost hear her hesitation. "Colin, it would be very awkward for me to try to set you up with anyone." "Oh, no, it's nothing like that. It's just that I can already see myself asking a girl out to my apartment, And to be honest, it's looking a little run down right now, more like a bachelor pad. Can I hire you to decorate? You've always had much better taste than me. Wow, I didn't see that coming. But of course, I guess I could do it. I just finished a big design project, so I could do yours right now. Is there a time next week when I could come by and take a look? Sure. I work from home 3 days a week now, so Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday would be fine with me. That's great. I'm planning on coming in Tuesday afternoon. When Colin let her into his apartment the following Tuesday, Celia saw at once what he was talking about. The walls were painted a dirty white, the carpet was wiped and faded, and the furniture was mostly made up of stuff he'd taken out of their old house. I feel like we could go in different directions, she told him, looking around the room. Why don't you tell me what style you want? He shrugged helplessly. Honestly, Celia, I don't really know much about styles or color theory or anything. He looked around uncertainly, then brightened. I'd like you to design a space you'd like. He waved his hands quickly. Not in the sense of something feminine and pink. I definitely want it to look like a straight male lives here. But I don't want this place to look like a sports bar. He gestured in her direction. Just a place that someone like you would enjoy. One where a woman with good taste would feel comfortable. I can only trust you to do that. That's very flattering, Colin. In fact, I think I know exactly what you want. Let me go back to my studio and work out a plan. Then I'll come back to you with some options and we'll see what you like. That's great. Thank you, Celia. I really appreciate it. For the next 2 months, Celia met with Colin almost once a week. They had to choose a design project, review and tweak the proposed decor, and then oversee the renovations they had agreed upon. After that, she continually brought him fabric samples, paint samples, and pictures of furniture for approval. Colin was pleased with the progress, but that wasn't the case with Vince. Do you really have to see this guy so often? He complained to his wife one evening when she returned from another visit to Colin's apartment. Well, no, darling. I don't see Colin any more often than I see any of my other clients. Besides, I thought you were comfortable with him, especially after his wedding present to us. I guess he really has put it behind him, she reassured him. Yeah, maybe, but you two have a history, and I can't help but wonder if he's really over you. Well, I have forgotten him. In fact, if you come into the bedroom with me, I'll show you how much I've forgotten him. Although Celia thought she had succeeded in calming Vince's jealousy, she feared that Colin's next request might reignite her husband's jealousy. During one of his visits, he asked her out of the blue, "Are you still in the book club?" Yes, I am. We meet every other Saturday afternoon." "Why? Is it just for women, or do you mind if a man joins?" "I don't know. I don't think we've ever had a man ask to join. Why, are you interested?" "As a matter of fact, I am. I've told you before that I want to start dating again, but I don't really know what to talk to a woman about. Most girls I know aren't interested in sports, so we probably won't have anything in common. So here I was thinking that if I knew more about the books my date might read, it would at least give me a conversation starter." She nodded. "Okay, I understand that. It's actually quite insightful of you. How about this? At the next meeting of our book club, I'll bring it up. If they're okay with it, I'll let you know and you can come to the next meeting. If not, I'll at least let you know what book we've chosen so you can read it for yourself." "I really appreciate that, Celia. Of course, I would prefer to participate in the discussion and hear what you ladies think of the book. But if they're not comfortable with a male presence, I'll read it on my own." When Celia broached the subject with her book club friends, she was pleasantly surprised that they were enthusiastic about Colin's offer to join their group. "If you don't mind your ex-husband's presence, we'd welcome a male perspective," they told her. Celia noted with amusement that the two single ladies seemed most interested in having Colin join. At their first meeting, Colin had completely won over even those members who had expressed doubts. Unlike a few ladies, Colin did finish the book and was able to make some insightful remarks. He was careful not to dominate the discussion. Celia was relieved to see that Colin was respectful of different opinions and repeatedly encouraged the thoughts of the others. At the end of the meeting, everyone announced that the experiment had been a success, and Colin hugged everyone as he left. Celia noted that the loners were particularly ebullient in expressing their appreciation. Colin not only attended the next meeting, but invited the group to hold the session in his newly renovated condominium. Upon arrival, for the first half hour the ladies oohed and awed over the design, and Colin never failed to emphasize that it was all Celia's doing. According to custom, the host of the meeting was supposed to offer hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Colin did not trifle and provided a couple of cutting boards with appetizers, as well as several bottles of Prosecco to keep the conversation going. The ensuing book discussion may not have shone with intelligence, but it was certainly lively. When it was time to leave, everyone was scattered with gratitude. One of the single ladies, a pretty red-haired girl named Kelly, was so insistent in her gratitude that Celia had to distract Colin with an imaginary errand. When everyone had left, Celia stayed behind, offering to help Colin with the cleanup. He gratefully agreed. After the used plates and glasses were sent to the dishwasher, he walked her to the exit. Taking her hands in his, he thanked her for her help and for supporting his joining the group. She shook her head. "Actually, I should be the one thanking you. Everyone had a great time, as you could probably tell, and I think you added a lot to our discussion. Plus, I really appreciate all your compliments on the decor. That was really nice of you." "You're welcome," he replied. "And thanks for sparing me from Kelly," he added slyly. She tensed instantly. "You should watch out for her, Colin. She's a nice girl, but she's too young for you, and from what I hear, she's a bit of a heartbreaker, if you know what I mean." He nodded solemnly, hiding his amusement at her reaction. Celia smiled again. "I have to go home now, but thanks again for everything." She hugged him and kissed his cheek, then pulled away and looked at him carefully. "I feel like I've seen a different side of you, Colin. I like that." She kissed his cheek again, then turned and walked away. When Vince found out about Celia's new book club member, he was very upset and demanded that she forbid Colin from coming again. She, on the other hand, was visibly annoyed. "I won't do anything of the sort," she replied. "The other girls like him, and he looks like a great addition to our group. So stop being jealous, Vince. Nothing's going on, and you look stupid pretending it is." Vince managed to keep his feelings to himself, but that night he felt a strong desire to win his wife back. Their lovemaking was unusually vigorous. Vince seemed determined to reassert his dominance. Celia realized what was happening and decided it was wise not to protest. The next morning, Vince apologized for the way he'd treated her, but she dismissed his concerns. "I wouldn't want it to be like this every time," she told him, "but sometimes a change of scenery wouldn't hurt." Relieved, he set off to work with a light step. As soon as he left, her forced smile quickly disappeared. Putting on her sundress, Celia found that she was still in pain after yesterday, so she took another capsule. Swallowing it with breakfast, she drove to her design studio to see what was planned for the new week. Seeing that the rug for Colin's apartment had already been delivered, she quickly called him and offered to bring it over. His agreement floored her. After checking her makeup, she headed over to his place. Once he let her in, she quickly placed the small rug on the designated spot. Colin complimented her choice, then invited her to stay for a moment and have a cup of coffee. She readily agreed. As she sank down on the new sofa, however, she wrinkled her nose in distaste, and Colin caught it at once. "Is something wrong, Celia?" he asked with a note of concern in his voice. "Nothing," she answered. "Vince was a little aggressive with me last night, and I'm a little sore this morning, that's all." She couldn't help but notice the frown that flickered across his face, replaced by a determined look. Without a word, he pushed the coffee table away from the couch. Then he picked up his new rug and spread it out in front of her. Placing a pillow in the middle, he invited her to stretch out on the rug. She protested weakly, but relented when he insisted. As she lay face down on the rug with her thighs propped up on the pillow, he sat on top of her and began rubbing her neck, starting at the base of her skull. As his fingers stroked and pressed, the tension from her body began to drain away, and she let out a satisfied moan. His hands then traveled down to her shoulders and then along her spine, working on her buttocks. Soon Celia was purring like a contented cat as he kneaded the sore muscles of her back. She was just about ready to fall asleep when she felt him move lower, sliding his hands under her hip bones and lifting them slightly. The effect was impressive. The pain she felt there was gone. After working on her hips for a few minutes, he released them and placed his hands on her dainty ass. She caught her breath as his hands squeezed and massaged her, but before she could protest, he moved lower again. Now he was kneading the back of her thighs and gently pressing his thumbs into her calves. A few minutes of this, and he moved to her feet, removing her shoes and working the soles and toes. God, Colin, this feels heavenly. I'm turning to mush. He didn't say anything. Instead, he lowered her feet and began to slowly work his way up her calves, first pressing on her Achilles tendons and then lightly running his fingertips over her skin. He smiled to himself as he noticed her breathing quicken. There was no trace now of any pretense that this was a massage. After a few minutes, he rolled onto his back and Celia wriggled her arms around him, resting her head on his chest. She started to say something but stopped, hesitant to say what she was thinking. Instead, she pressed down harder, savoring the warmth of his body. The silence of their breathing was interrupted by Celia's phone ringing. She ignored it, but then reluctantly took the phone out of her bag. When she saw who was calling, she sat up straight and picked it up. Hey, Vince, what's up? I'm sorry I missed your previous call. I've been busy with some things. No, I'm not busy right now. Sure, lunch sounds good. Where do you want to meet? Okay, great. I'll be there in half an hour. Love you, babe. She turned and looked at Colin apologetically. Sorry, I gotta go. She dashed into the guest bathroom and cleaned herself up as best she could. Stepping out of the bathroom, she headed for the door. But before she left, she turned to him. We need to talk. I'll call you. Colin nodded in understanding and she disappeared. At lunch, Vince questioned her again about where she'd been and what she'd been doing, but Celia elaborated on her earlier excuses. Eventually, he dropped the subject. He thought he noticed something unusual about her, but couldn't figure out what it was. That night, he wanted sex with her again and ignored her words about being too tired. At home, after he returned to his office, she managed to shower, but she was still afraid that he would manage to find some evidence of her infidelity. However, Colin had been so gentle in his lovemaking that Vince hadn't detected the slightest hint of her cheating. Nevertheless, she was relieved when he finished and fell asleep. As for Celia, she lay awake for a long time thinking about her morning encounter with Colin. Once again, she had to fake a finish with Vince. Perhaps as a result of this, her subsequent dreams were quite erotic. The next day, Colin was working at his computer in his home office when his cell phone rang. Looking at the display, he was not surprised to see that it was Celia. She had begged him to meet with her to talk, and he invited her to come over right away. Disconnecting, he quickly finished the report he was working on for his office and then prepared a text message on his other phone. When he received a signal from the security door of the condominium and recognized it was Celia, he pressed send on his phone and invited her in. As he opened the front door, he saw Celia with a concerned expression on her face. She stepped inside, and he closed the door behind her, then turned and looked at her intently. Colin, we need to talk about what happened yesterday, she began, but he pressed his fingers to her lips to stop her. She stared at him in confusion until he stepped closer to her and replaced his fingers with her lips. Oh, God, she exhaled and responded passionately to the kiss. As their tongues sought each other, he led her backward into his bedroom, unbuttoning his clothes as he went. By now she was breathing heavily and quickly began to pull off his knit shirt, tugging it over her head and throwing it to the floor before hurriedly reaching for his belt. The two of them managed to undress each other before Colin picked Celia up in his arms and laid her on the bed. There was no slow build-up this time. Now their passion instantly skyrocketed to the boiling point. Vince was working at his desk when an anonymous text message arrived on his personal cell phone. If you want to find Celia, go to Colin's bedroom, it read. Who's that? He dialed back but got no response. Normally he would have ignored a text from an unfamiliar phone, but this message reinforced the paranoia he'd long felt. Grabbing his car keys, he rushed into the office garage and raced to Colin's apartment. Arriving at Colin's apartment in the morning, Celia didn't know what she wanted, but the only thing that mattered to her now was as much tenderness from Colin as possible. Vince pulled into the parking lot of Colin's condominium with a roar. Noticing Celia's car, He pulled in front of the main entrance, not bothering to look for a parking space. Jumping out of the car, he saw a tenant getting out and hurried to the open door before it could close. Once inside, he stopped in the entryway to get his bearings. Then he took the stairs to the second floor, not wanting to risk Colin and Celia hearing the elevator. Once on the landing, he hurried straight to the entrance of Colin's apartment. His first thought was to slam his shoulder into the door and rush in, but when he grasped the doorknob, it turned readily in his hand. "That stupid asshole forgot to lock the door," he exclaimed. Slipping into the apartment, he sneaked into the master bedroom. There was no doubt about where to go or what to look for. He could hear Celia's moans and blasphemies clearly. Then, as he watched the agony, she collapsed onto Colin's chest. "What the hell, Celia?" Vince roared. "How could you do this to me, especially to him?" Shocked, she turned her head sharply and saw the one she most wanted to avoid. Vince was standing there in obvious pain and anger, his fists clenched, tears streaming down his cheeks. "No, Vince. No, you have to let me explain," she began, but Vince didn't let her finish. "There's nothing to explain, you cheating whore. You broke my heart. I never want to see you again." With those words, he turned and staggered blindly out of the bedroom, heading for the front door. "Wait, Vince, stop! You can't be serious." "Wait a second," Celia shouted, desperately pulling on her clothes to follow her husband. Colin watched Celia leave in silence. Then he got dressed and returned to his office. Noticing the phone left on the desk, he picked it up and tossed it in the trash. "I don't think I'll ever need it again," he said to himself. As the phone fell to the bottom of the trash can, the last message he had sent flashed on the screen. "If you want to find Celia, stop by Colin's bedroom." He was still working when he was interrupted by a timid knock on the front door. When he opened it, Celia entered the room, dragging a large suitcase behind her. She turned to face him, and Colin saw that her eyes were red and her makeup was running down her cheeks. "Vince kicked me out," she said tearfully. "And how is he?" Colin asked. "He's a mess," she told him. "He's yelling at me or crying his eyes out." I didn't understand much of what he said. The only thing that was clear was that the sight of me was killing him, and that he wanted me gone as soon as possible. She shook her head. "I'm really worried about him, but I don't know what I can do." Colin nodded. "I know the feeling." Then her grim expression cleared. "But at least now you and I can be together. We won't have to hide how we feel about each other." She raised her arms to hug him, but his response stopped her. "I don't think so." It wasn't just his words that confused her, but his tone as well. "What did you say?" she asked. "Actually, you're right, Celia. We don't need to hide our feelings anymore. And my feelings are that I wouldn't take you back even if you were the last woman in the world. I'd be crazy to bring a cheating woman back into my life. No, not even a two-time cheater." She was shocked by his outburst, but quickly tried to regain the upper hand. "I may have cheated on Vince, but I did it to make up for my mistake when I dumped you. Now I'm back, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing you how loving and loyal I can be." "You really are a piece of work," Colin grinned. "You treat men like interchangeable parts. When you get tired of one, you swap him for another. If the second one doesn't work out, you just go back to the first." "It's not fair, Colin. Besides, you wanted me. You seduced me." He nodded his head in sarcastic agreement. "Oh, sure, I understand. All it takes is for some guy to be nice to you, give you a couple of compliments, maybe give you a gift, and you'll drop your panties in no time." "No, I'm not." "Yes, it is, and I'm sure if I take you back, I'll do the same thing again. I've got news for you, Celia. I've seen what you're really like. As the song goes, we'll never be together." He walked to the front door, swung it open, and threw her bag out into the hallway. "Get out!" he shouted. Tears streamed down her face, her breathing punctuated by sobs. "Oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Where am I supposed to go?" He crossed his arms over his chest. "If you want my opinion, I'd suggest you go straight to hell." Shrinking under his anger, she staggered out the door, and Colin quickly slammed it shut, remembering to put the deadbolt on this time. Then he walked over to the couch and sat down on it, feeling the adrenaline drain slowly from his system. Relaxing, he thought about everything that had happened. I wonder what Dr. Helmar would say about all of this. After all, I had followed at least some of his instructions, hadn't I? Found the wisdom to realize that I could change, and the courage to make changes, even if sometimes I had to hold my nose. But I'll leave the search for humility to Vince and Celia. He shook his head. I don't think either of them will find it easy to achieve serenity. Vince will have to come to terms with the fact that he's a soon-to-be-divorced cuckold. Celia will have to accept the fact that she's a cheating whore who got kicked out of the house and is about to be divorced a second time. He smiled grimly. Maybe I should send them Dr. Helmar's card. Satisfied, he looked around, admiring his newly decorated apartment. Then he went back to his office and sat down at his desk. As he did so, he noticed the card with Kelly's name and number on it. On the back of it was handwritten, "Call me sometime." He nodded to himself. I think I'm ready to do that.